Released in 2019 alongside the iPhone 11 Pro and 11 Pro Max, the iPhone 11 was the successor to the very popular iPhone XR, and likewise served as a more budget-oriented device, featuring the majority of the specs and features of its Pro counterpart. We're talking the same processor, same wide and ultra-wide cameras, and a premium build that only lacked the high-resolution OLED screen. The iPhone 11 even managed to cost $50 less than the XR when it first came out, marking one of the only times Apple has actually lowered the price of one of their phones, and making the iPhone 11 5 years ago one of the best value smartphones you could buy. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and in 2024, the iPhone 11 is fully updatable to iOS 18. Specifically, I'm currently running a beta version of iOS 18, with the full release coming in the fall, and this phone is very likely to get iOS 19 the fall of 2025. I want to split this review up into focusing on a few core issues that arise with any smartphone this old. We're going to start with the viability and usability in 2024, then we'll move into the actual phone itself, the device, the hardware, the camera, and wrap things up from there. But to start this off, there is no question there's going to be drawbacks with any older smartphone, never mind one a half-decade old. There's a strong chance it's been used for a good chunk of that half-decade, although in fairness, Apple was selling the iPhone 11 up until the fall of 2022 when the iPhone 14 line came out. So you could have an iPhone 11 right now that's only about 2 years old, in which case the battery might not be so bad. Even so, smartphone batteries do degrade with usage, and poor battery health can quickly lead to an inconsistent and frustrating experience. You can check your battery health in settings, battery health, and once you're around and under 80%, you'll notice the phone telling you to get your battery serviced. It's at this point that issues will likely become more noticeable, and you can always get the battery replaced by Apple as suggested for a fee. Given the age of the phone, I'd almost recommend just getting a new smartphone altogether, but it depends on your situation, and if you do have a healthy or at least usable battery, the good news is that the iPhone 11 since launch has always had pretty decent battery life, easily getting users a day out of it in 2019, and depending on the context of what you're doing, I still think that can be the case today. Video streaming, gaming, and the like will of course drain the battery faster, but even then, something like a portable battery bank might be a decent solution to get some more life out of your phone. The upside to all this is that iOS 18 runs pretty darn well in my experience, and the iPhone 11 doesn't really feel like a phone turning 5. And with the 2018 iPhone XR getting iOS 18 as well, it's a very safe bet to assume iOS 19 will come to the iPhone 11 and 11 Pro, meaning software support from 2019 to 2026. It'll be the fall of 2026 when iOS 20 comes out, which who knows if it'll come to the iPhone 11, I'd say probably not, but it could. And technically, to be fair, we don't know for sure that the iPhone 11 will get iOS 19, but given the XR and XS situation, I do think it's very likely. Even if the 11 somehow didn't get the update, apps on the App Store tend to support phones for a few years extra. The iPhone 11 absolutely can be a viable option for multiple more years from now, and it certainly cannot be considered obsolete anytime soon, realistically speaking. The iPhone 11 also benefits from a ton of positive changes that were added over its predecessor, such as the ultra-wide camera lens, speed improvements, and other basic incremental changes. The display is easily its lowest quality feature, which we'll briefly discuss, but I don't think it's something most users will truly care too much about. The biggest improvements coming to a newer iPhone, if you do want to upgrade, will be the screen, the cameras, although the 11's actually not too bad in this department, and most majorly, the battery life. Performance too, but the core iOS experience really won't drastically shift. iOS 18 is iOS 18, and whether you're running it on an iPhone 11 or an iPhone 15 Pro, both phones can basically download the same apps and do the same things when you boil it down. I don't think it would be a bad time to upgrade from the iPhone 11, especially with the iPhone 16 line launching. Few people want to use a phone that's 5 years old, even if it's an iPhone, which iPhones do tend to provide more longevity than competing smartphones. But it all comes down to your own personal situation and how many inconveniences you can stomach dealing with that come with an older device. If you have a battery that's shot, you're very likely ready to upgrade, and that's completely justified. If you still feel like the 11 is doing well enough for you and you don't need to buy anything new, then I would always encourage people to get as much life out of their phone as they possibly can. Then there's the category of people on something older, looking at the 11 as a prospective budget smartphone option, and this is by no means a wild suggestion. If you're on like the iPhone 10, I would go to something a bit better, but below that I think the 11 would feel like a pretty decent upgrade. On eBay.com and USD, the 11 currently starts at around $200, and while I definitely want a phone with solid battery health, this doesn't feel unreasonable considering it does provide the vast majority of the same iOS experience a phone quadruple its price point would. The iPhone 11 is and always has been a really good phone, and while it is starting to feel its age, I think it's still managed to hold up as well as any smartphone possibly can a half-decade later from its launch. There's a reason Apple was selling it up to only 2 years ago. It's a good phone. In short, the iPhone 11 is still very much a solid smartphone, and while while there are always going to be caveats to this like the battery life, the core experience holds up, and that's what I personally believe is most worth emphasizing. But for now, let's back up a little bit here and discuss the design, the hardware, and photography, and then circle back to its viability and value in 2024 and beyond. The iPhone 11 came in a plethora of colors, going for a more muted color palette than that of the iPhone XR, but still continuing the general design trend. I've always preferred having the brighter colors of the XR, but both phones look amazing and have their merit. Of course, I've got the purple here and I love it. It's a really nice looking phone. The iPhone 11 is in fact practically identical to the XR in design, with the same aluminum frame and glossy glass backing, in contradistinction to the stainless steel and frosted glass of the iPhone 11 Pro, although the 11 still feels very premium. And there are some key differences between the XR and 11 that are immediately noticeable. The first is the extra ultra-wide camera lens on the back of the 11, and this whole square camera bump setup being much more prominent than the single lens on the back of the XR. The second difference is the centered Apple logo, which was new in 2019 and something I personally got used to a lot faster than I ever thought I would. The curved aluminum sides present a fairly bulky build, but not one too heavy, and still very comfortable in the hand. It's a nice contrast to the flat squared sides of newer iPhones, starting with the 12, and some people do swear by this older design. I can go either way, but it feels good to hold and use, which is what I most care about. The extra chunk here is in large part thanks to the 6.1-inch LCD Retina display, which was always one of its more controversial aspects when it came to these phones, the resolution specifically being 828 by 1792, making for a pixel density of 326 pixels per inch, the same as most of Apple's Retina iPhones throughout the 2010s. Now, if these numbers don't really mean much to you, congratulations, you won't have any problems with this display. There's no question it's not as sharp nor vibrant as an OLED iPhone, and the more muted colors and lack of true blacks doesn't provide as much immersion, but these are cosmetic differences that don't actually change anything about the core experience. I keep coming back to that one phrase, core experience, because I think it's the thing that too often is overlooked by some users and reviewers. It's what you actually do with your phone, the day-to-day, the social media, texting, watching video, gaming, whatever it is you do on your phone. While having the more vibrant OLED panel of the iPhone 11 Pro might look nicer and feel nicer, that's all it really is. It's not a bad screen, it's just not as fancy as the 11 Pro or the 12 and better, but it also doesn't need to be. It's totally fair if you do want a better display, and in that case I'd absolutely look at a newer phone than the 11, but for those of us who don't really care, the 11 will get the job done. Notably, the iPhone 11 Pro had two size options at 5.8 inches and 6.5 inches, making the iPhone 11 and its 6.1 inches almost the perfect in-between size, and it's now the standard size for iPhones today since the 2020 12 Pro. The phone is neither too small nor too big, it's almost perfect. We've also got Face ID here, which feels fast and works really well, just like on every other iPhone with a notch. On the bottom of the phone we have the Lightning ports, and the glass back allows for wireless charging. There is no MagSafe here, which would come on the next year's iPhone 12. We also don't have 5G, but just 4G LTE, which I think is enough for basically anybody, so I wouldn't worry about it. We also have IP68 water resistance, so a quick drop in the sink or toilet needn't be a concern for users. For storage, the iPhone 11 came in at 64, 128, and 256 gigabyte variations. 64 gigs being the baseline might feel a little bit limiting for some users, particularly those who take a lot of pictures and video. And if you are finding yourself low on storage, I would recommend using Apple's iCloud Plus subscription. It's surprisingly good value, and it has the added benefit of keeping your photos backed up on the cloud in case of something happening to your device. For only a couple bucks a month, not too shabby, and it makes 64 gigs hopefully enough storage to get by for most people. The true value of the iPhone 11, like the XR, came with two major improvements to iPhones that come each and every year: the camera systems and processing power. We're at a point where smartphones don't really change as much as they used to year, as they're already so good, and so the 11 was able to provide some of the best features of the most expensive 11 Pro while simply cutting back in the design and display departments, thus making for a very much solid value. This means we have Apple's A13 chipset and 4GB of RAM, the same specs as the 11 Pro and 11 Pro Max, very top of the line in 2019 and still no slouch 5 years later. The iPhone 11 runs iOS 18 with very few issues in my experience, and keep in mind this is still an early beta version, so it's a good sign. There are a few little moments of lag or slowdown, but that can be expected from any iPhone regardless of its age, especially on a beta version, and overall the performance was just good. Honestly, it was fine. If Apple is giving one of their phones an update, it should be able to run that update well, and the 11 seems to live up to that standard in my eyes. The additional customization with iOS 18 also offers some cool options in how the phone can look, with my purple iPhone 11 really rocking those purple tinted icons, somehow making this phone even better than it was when it first came out, at least in terms of software variety and functionality. So the design and the hardware are solid and don't yet feel their age. Performance is good, aside from potentially the battery if it's in poor health. So let's talk about the cameras. This is always one of the more difficult topics to approach, since on one hand, cameras are one of those things new iPhones have improved upon the most over the years, and photos compared to something from the 15 Pro do show a definite difference in quality. But the thing is, the iPhone 11 still takes very good pictures, regardless of its age, and it ultimately does manage to capture the moments and memories you want to remember just as well as a newer device. Maybe the lighting isn't quite as good, maybe there's a little more grain or less detail, but it's still capturing the same image. The selfie camera here was also an upgrade over the 10R at 12 megapixels from 7. Not too much to say here, it takes selfies just fine, and you do have the option for both a wider and cropped in image, just like the newest iPhones today. But back to the more interesting rear lenses. Both are 12 megapixels, one being the main wide lens and one being the ultra wide, which offers 0.5 times zoom. This does give a lot more versatility in how you take pictures, but we are of course missing the third lens from the 11 Pro, which would be the 2x zoom telephoto. I don't think this is the biggest deal, and the photos you take with the 11 can be truly breathtaking in the right conditions. Having the ultra wide and the wide I think is enough for most people. Normally once you get into lower light situations, the age really starts to show on older iPhones, and that's sort of the case here, but not nearly as much as with the iPhone XR and XS. Back in 2019, the 11 and 11 Pro were the first iPhones to bring a proper night mode for photos, and they overall got a lot better in low light conditions, finally allowing for decent pictures both at night or even just indoors, whereas before those photos tended to be just a grainy, blurry mess. The image comparison here with the iPhone XR should give you an impression of how night and day this difference truly is. The better low light photography in combination with the extra camera lens made this phone even better value, and it never felt like much of a downgrade from its Pro counterpart because it wasn't. It just was missing the telephoto lens, that's it, not a big deal. You've also got the typical stuff, 4K 60 video recording, this is 30 FPS but it looks great, and you've got an array of portrait modes and different features making for an all-in-all pretty solid camera setup even 5 years later. Is it as good as modern options? Absolutely not, but it still holds up well, and it'll do the job for the vast majority of users out there. If the photography is a concern for you, and you want to get the best pictures possible, I'd fully recommend getting a newer iPhone, but if what you've seen here looks good enough, then I wouldn't be too worried about the iPhone 11 in 2024 and even beyond. And ultimately, I think that's the main theme of this video. You don't need to be too worried about the iPhone 11, assuming the battery's fine. The iPhone 11 presents an experience maybe not as flashy or technically impressive as the newest iPhones today, but one just as functional when it comes to that core iOS experience. It runs practically any app and does practically anything the newest $1,000 plus iPhones can do, all at a price point around $200 US, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending where you look. For someone on a budget, I think the iPhone 11 is an interesting option, and being able to run the latest version of iOS, along with having hardware that's aged pretty well for the most part, makes this a fair purchase in my eyes. While I don't necessarily recommend buying a phone this old, if you're careful and buy a phone from a good seller with a healthy battery, I think your experience will end up being pretty good, especially if you're coming from an even older smartphone that's been giving you trouble. If you're someone who uses their phone a lot throughout the day and wants to do more with it, a newer iPhone might be the way to go, if only for the battery life. But for those of you using or looking to use the iPhone 11 right now who just don't feel like they need anything more, hey, more power to you. Get as much life out of your device as you can, because why not? The iPhone 11 is still good. As much as Apple tends to overprice their products, they do provide very solid longevity, and you might as well take advantage for as long as possible. The iPhone 11 holds up well in 2024, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. And so with that, I think I'm right about done here. Any of you using the iPhone 11 right now? How's your battery life? Do you think the phone still holds up, or should people look to get something newer? Definitely curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. While I do my best to review these older phones, it's the actual daily users who always provide the most insight. But hopefully this video did help you out, and if it did or you found it interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. Huge shout out to the channel members, you guys are the absolute best, and thank you so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.